My mother-in-law didn't raise her voice. She didn't even look at me when she said it. She just swept her eyes around my dining room, smiled, and told everyone at the table that the house belonged to her son. I'd lived in that house for 20 years. I bought it. And in that one sentence, I realized she didn't just misspeak. She'd been quietly rewriting my life for 2 decades, and I was the only one who'd ever noticed. It started as an ordinary Sunday. The kind that smelled like chicken pot pie and felt like nothing was wrong. I'd spent the morning getting things ready, the way I always did before Daniel's mother came over after church. Not because I was trying to impress her. After 20 years, I'd stopped trying to impress anyone in that family. I did it because I liked the house to feel cared for. I liked walking through rooms that looked like someone loved them. Diane arrived a little after 1, with a tin of something she'd baked and a compliment ready before she'd even taken her coat off. She's not a hard woman to be around, on the surface. She remembers to ask about my clients. She laughs at the right moments. If you only saw her at the door, you'd think she was exactly what people say she is, gracious. We sat down to eat, and for a while it was easy. Daniel told a story about a bridge inspection that had gone sideways. Diane asked about Emma's classes. I remember thinking, somewhere in the back of my mind, that this was a good day, one of the easy ones. Then Daniel mentioned, just in passing, that the Hendersons 2 streets over had sold their place for almost double what anyone expected. Diane looked around the dining room, slowly. The way you look at something you're deciding how to feel about. And then she smiled and said it so lightly, so naturally, that for a second I almost let it pass straight through me the way I'd let 1,000 other things pass through me. Well, if anything ever happened to you two, at least this house would stay in the Mitchell family. After all, it belongs to my son. Nobody said anything right away. Daniel laughed, a short, uncomfortable sound, the kind of laugh that exists to fill space rather than express anything. He reached for his water glass like he needed something to do with his hands. I put my fork down. I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment, because for years afterward I tried to convince myself it had been smaller than it was. It wasn't anger. Anger would have been easier, in a way. It was something quieter and colder than that. It was the feeling of hearing someone describe your life back to you and not recognizing yourself in it. I sat there with my fork resting against the edge of my plate, and I thought about the deeds sitting in a folder at Michael Harris's office, and the worn leather pouch in my safe at home, and the brass key I still kept tucked inside it. I thought about standing alone in this house, in this exact room, before there were flowers on the table or jazz from the speakers, before any of us were a family at all. I had bought this house with money I earned showing other people how to build stable lives, back when I was building my own one commission at a time. I had stood in this empty dining room 20 years ago and thought, this is mine, I did this. And somewhere in the years since, that fact had quietly dissolved into something else, into family lore, into Daniel's house, into a sentence Diane could say without even noticing she was saying it. That was the part that frightened me, if I'm being honest. Not that she believed it. That she said it like it had never been anything else. I looked at Daniel. He gave me a small, apologetic glance, the kind that says, I know, but also says, please don't make this into something, and then he changed the subject, asking his mother if she wanted more iced tea. And I let him. I let the moment close the way I'd let 100 moments close before it. I smiled. I cleared the plates. I told myself, the way I always did, that it wasn't worth the friction, that Diane was 70 years old and set in the only version of the world she'd ever known, that correcting her would feel petty when the house was paid for, when the marriage was good, when nothing was actually at stake. It wasn't until later, standing at the sink with my hands in warm water, that the thought arrived the way thoughts do when you finally stopped running from them. This wasn't the first time. It was just the first time I'd let myself notice. I dried my hands and went out to the back porch, the way I do most mornings before anyone else is awake, except this time it was late afternoon and the light was already turning gold over the garden. I sat down with the last of my coffee, gone cold in the cup, and I let myself sit with the question instead of pushing it away. I have always thought of myself as patient, calm. The kind of person who doesn't need to win every conversation to feel secure in who she is. For years, I told myself that staying quiet in moments like this was a form of grace, a way of protecting the peace in a family I loved. But sitting on that porch, I started to wonder if I had it backward, if what I called patience was really just practice. 20 years of practice letting things go, until letting go became the only thing I knew how to do. I thought about my father's office, all those Saturdays I spent answering phones and filing permits, while people praised him for a business I quietly helped run since I was 12 years old. I thought about how easily I had learned even then that the people who do the work are not always the people who get remembered for it. I had told myself for so long that this was just how families were, that you didn't keep score, that love wasn't supposed to need credit. But sitting there with my cold coffee, I asked myself something I hadn't let myself ask before. If I never said anything, if I let this go the way I'd let everything else go, would there come a day when I looked around this house and didn't recognize my own place in it at all? I didn't have an answer yet. I just knew, for the first time in 20 years, that I wasn't willing to stop asking the question. If this is already hitting close to home, go ahead and hit subscribe. There's a lot more to this story, and I promise it gets harder to look away. A few days passed before I let myself think about it again. Not because I'd made peace with it, I just hadn't had a quiet enough moment to let it back in. It found me anyway, the way these things do, in the hallway outside the kitchen, where we keep all the photographs. I'd walked past that wall 1,000 times. I straighten the frames when they go crooked. I dust them on Sundays. I could probably tell you where every single picture was taken without looking twice. But that afternoon, I actually stopped. I stood there with a basket of laundry against my hip and looked at them the way you'd look at something for the first time. There's one from the kitchen renovation, taken maybe 12 years ago. Daniel's mother had brought it up at Thanksgiving the year after, telling some cousin how Daniel had finally given the kitchen the upgrade it deserved. I remember smiling when she said it. I remember not correcting her. I had spent 4 months choosing every tile, every fixture, sitting up some nights with paint swatches taped to the wall so I could watch how the light changed them by morning. Daniel had picked the refrigerator. That was the extent of it. And he'd have told you so himself if anyone had asked him directly. Nobody ever did. There's another one of the garden, the summer. Emma turned 10. A neighbor's voice came back to me, unprompted, the way old voices do. Your husband chose a wonderful neighborhood. I'd smiled at her too. I always smiled. I designed the bed under the dogwood myself, every inch of it, and I let a stranger hand the credit to a man who couldn't tell a hydrangea from a hosta. I stood in that hallway a long time, just looking, and something started to come loose in me. Not all at once, more like a thread you don't realize is fraying until the whole hem gives way. Because it wasn't only Diane's voice in those memories, it was Daniel's silence sitting right next to it. He never said any of those things himself, but he never said the truth either. He let the kitchen become his upgrade, and the garden become his neighborhood, and I'd let myself believe that not arguing was the same thing as not minding. I thought about my father, then, the way I hadn't let myself in a long time. I was 12 the summer I started helping him with the business. Not because anyone asked me to. I just liked being useful, and he never told me not to be. I'd sit at the little desk in the back office after school, filing invoices, answering the phone in my best grown-up voice, learning which permits needed which signatures before I was old enough to drive. Men would come through that office all week long, slapping my father on the back, telling him what a fine operation he ran. Nobody ever once told the girl behind the desk that the operation ran smoother because of her. I didn't resent it then. I didn't have the vocabulary for what I was even noticing. I only knew, in the simple way children know things, that the people who did quiet work got quiet thanks, and the people who did visible work got visible praise, and I had apparently chosen the wrong kind of work to be good at. It happened again at 19 when I got the scholarship. A full one, the kind you don't get without years of grades and sleepless studying, and a guidance counselor's letter I'd practically begged for. My aunt told everyone at the family reunion that I was lucky. Just lucky. Like I'd found a coin on the sidewalk instead of earned something with my own 2 hands. I corrected her once. I remember the exact words I used, how careful I'd been not to sound proud. She laughed it off, said something about how modest I was being, and changed the subject. I never corrected anyone again after that. It felt safer, somehow, to let the story stand wrong than to be the one insisting on being right. By the time I bought my first investment property at 26, I didn't even bother. Friends assumed my parents had helped with the down payment. I let them assume it. It was easier than watching their faces try to recalculate who I was. And then there was the house. This house. The one I stood in alone at 27, the day after closing, before there was a single piece of furniture in it. I remember the sound my footsteps made on the bare hardwood, how big and empty and entirely mine the silence felt. I had a brass key in my coat pocket that day, still warm from where I'd been turning it over and over in my hand the whole drive home from the attorney's office. I remember standing in the middle of that empty living room and feeling, for the first time in my adult life, like something I built belonged to no one's story but my own. I didn't know yet how easily that feeling could be borrowed from me, one casual sentence at a time, until it didn't feel like mine anymore at all. Standing in that hallway with the laundry basket still on my hip, I finally let myself say the thing I'd been avoiding for 20 years. This wasn't Diane misspeaking at a Sunday lunch. This was the ending of a story that had been writing itself since I was a girl behind a desk nobody noticed. I have spent my whole life being loved by people who somehow never quite saw me. And I don't think any of them did it on purpose. That's the part that makes it so hard to be angry. It's much easier to fight someone who means you harm than to untangle yourself from people who love you and simply never learn to look. I set the laundry basket down on the hall table, right beneath the photograph of the garden, and I stood there a moment longer than I needed to. Because somewhere underneath the recognition, a smaller, quieter question was already waiting for me. If I had carried this silence for 20 years without anyone forcing my hand, what would it actually cost me to keep carrying it? And whether Daniel, who'd laughed so easily over his water glass a few days before, had even begun to notice that something in me had already started to change. Emma came home for a long weekend in October, the way she always did when her course load let up enough to breathe. I'd made her favorite, the lemon chicken with the little roasted potatoes, and she sat up on the counter the way she'd done since she was small, swinging her feet while I worked. We talked about nothing important, her roommate situation, a professor she liked. The kind of conversation that's really just 2 people enjoying being in the same room. Then, out of nowhere, while I was rinsing the colander, she asked, "Mom, did you actually buy this house?" I didn't turn around right away. I remember the water running over my hands, warmer than it needed to be, and the particular stillness that comes right before you decide whether to keep hiding behind something or finally put it down. "Yes," I said, "I did. Before your dad and I were married." She didn't gasp. She didn't act shocked. She just nodded slowly, like a piece of something she'd been quietly assembling for years had finally clicked into place. "I thought so," she said. "I've just never heard anyone actually say it. Grandma always talks like it was Dad's idea, like he found it or built it or something." I shut off the water. "He helped paint a few rooms," I said, and I tried to make it sound light, but Emma's eyes stayed on me, patient and steady, the way they do when she's not going to let a joke be the end of the conversation. "That's not the same thing," she said. "No," I admitted, "it isn't. I don't know how to explain what that single exchange did to me. It was such a small thing, 3 sentences in a kitchen that smelled like lemon and rosemary. But I'd spent 20 years letting that fact live only inside my own head, where it didn't have to hold any weight at all. The moment I said it out loud to another person, and she simply believed me without needing convincing, it became something different. It became real in a way paperwork never quite manages to make anything real. Emma went quiet for a second, picking at the hem of her sleeve. It's kind of messed up that nobody's ever corrected her, she said. Not like, dramatically, just once, ever. I know, I said. Does it bother you? I thought about lying. It would have been easy, and it would have been exactly the kind of thing I'd done 1,000 times before. But something about the way she'd asked, like she actually wanted the truth, and not just the version that let us both relax, made me give her something closer to it. More than I let myself admit, I said. She didn't push further. She just reached over and squeezed my hand once before, hopping down off the counter to set the table, like she understood that some things only need to be said once to start changing shape. The dinner that night should have stayed as easy as the afternoon had been. It didn't. Diane and Daniel's father had come, and somewhere between the salad and the main course, Diane started talking about the lawyer they'd been meaning to see for their own estate planning. She mentioned it the way she mentioned most things lately, warmly, casually, as if she were simply tidying up loose ends. We really should sit down together soon, she said, looking between Daniel and me. Get everything properly settled. Make sure it's clear what stays with the Mitchell grandchildren. Daniel's fork paused halfway to his mouth. This house, obviously, she went on, reaching for her wine. And whatever's left of the lake property. I keep telling your father we should put it all down on paper now, while we're still sharp enough to do it right. She said it so easily, like she was reading off a grocery list instead of quietly drawing a map of a future that erased me from the deed of my own home. I glanced at Daniel. He was looking at his plate, jaw tight in that particular way he gets when he's decided silence is safer than the alternative. He didn't correct her. He didn't even look uncomfortable enough for anyone but me to notice. Emma noticed too. I felt it more than saw it, the way she went still across the table, her eyes flicking toward me and then quickly away, like she didn't want to be the one to say something neither of the adults in the room seemed willing to. I smiled at Diane. I passed her the rolls. I said something about the lawyer being a good idea, and the words came out smooth and pleasant, exactly the way they always had. But underneath the table, my hand had gone still against my napkin, and I found myself thinking, not for the first time that week, about the worn leather pouch sitting in the small safe in my office. I hadn't opened it in years. I didn't open it that night either. I only thought about it. About the weight of it. About how much longer a piece of paper could stay quiet in the dark before someone finally had to decide whether silence had become its own kind of lie. I waited until the lights were off, and Daniel had settled into the particular stillness that usually meant he was already halfway to sleep. I'd learned over 20 years that this was when he was easiest to reach, not because he was vulnerable, because the day's performance of being fine had finally worn off. "Daniel," I said into the dark, "are you awake?" A pause. "Yeah." I lay there a moment longer, listening to the ceiling fan turn overhead, the same low click it had made for a decade that we kept meaning to get fixed and never did. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to actually answer it instead of changing the subject." He shifted onto his side. I could feel him looking at me even though I couldn't see his face. "Okay. Why have you never corrected your mother? Not tonight, not once, in 20 years. He didn't answer right away. I'd expected him to reach for one of his usual lines. She doesn't mean anything by it, it's just how she talks. And for a second I braced myself for it. Instead he said quietly, "Because every time I think about doing it, I picture her face, and I don't want to be the reason she feels small." "And what about my face?" I asked. "Did you ever picture that?" The silence that followed was longer than the first one. I let it sit there. I'd spent 20 years filling silences like that one, smoothing them over before they could turn into anything uncomfortable. I didn't do it this time. "I thought I was protecting you," he finally said. "Both of you. I thought if I just didn't make it a thing, it would stay small." "It didn't stay small, Daniel. It just stayed quiet. Those aren't the same." He exhaled, and I heard something shift in him, the sound of a man realizing an old argument he'd been making to himself for years didn't hold up once it was said out loud to someone else. "I'm not trying to punish you," I said, softer now. "I just need you to understand what it's cost me to be the only one who remembered." And then, unprompted, He said something I wasn't expecting. I remember painting that living room. I went still. The week before the wedding, he said. You had on that old college t-shirt and there was nowhere to sit, so we just sat on the floor and ate pizza out of the box. I remember telling you I felt like I was moving into your place. You did say that, I said. My throat had gone tight in a way I hadn't braced for. I meant it as a joke, he said. But it wasn't really a joke, was it? No, I said, it wasn't. He went quiet again, and this time the silence felt different, not avoidant. Just heavy with something he was finally letting himself carry instead of setting down on me. I let 20 years go by, he said, telling myself that not arguing with her was the same thing as standing up for you. And it wasn't. It was just easier for me. I didn't say anything right away. I didn't need to. I could feel something shifting in the dark between us, something that had been frozen in place for so long, I'd stopped expecting it to move at all. After a while, I got up and went to the closet, to the small safe on the floor where I kept the few things that mattered enough to lock away. I hadn't opened it in longer than I wanted to admit. My hands knew the combination without needing to think about it. I came back to bed with the old leather pouch in my hands, worn soft at the corners from 20 years of sitting in the dark. Daniel sat up and turned on the lamp. I opened the pouch and the brass key slid out first, landing cool and small in my palm. I hadn't held it in years. It felt lighter than I remembered, and at the same time, heavier. Daniel looked at it like he was seeing an old friend he hadn't realized he'd missed. I haven't seen that since. Since the day I closed on this house, I said. Before I knew you well enough to fall in love with you. He reached out, not to take it from me, just to touch it once with the tip of his finger, the way you touch something you weren't sure you had the right to touch. What are you going to do with it? He asked. He didn't mean the key. We both knew that. I closed my hand around it, feeling the small, worn edges press into my palm. I don't know yet, I said. I just know I'm not putting it back in the dark. The estate planning meeting happened on a Thursday evening, which felt strange in itself. 20 years of family history rearranging itself, and it didn't even have the decency to happen on a Sunday. Diane and Daniel's father arrived a little after 6, and Daniel had set out a legal pad and a few printouts from the lawyer's office, the kind of administrative paperwork that's supposed to make a conversation feel orderly. I'd made coffee nobody really wanted. It gave my hands something to do. Diane settled into her usual chair, the one closest to the window, and opened with the same warmth she always carried into these moments. I spoke to the attorney again, she said, sliding a folder across the table toward Daniel. He thinks we should finalize things by spring. Get it all settled before your father and I get any older than we already are. Daniel didn't reach for the folder right away. As for this place, Diane went on, glancing around the dining room the way she had that Sunday months before, I told him it should just transfer straightforward, the way these things usually do. Daniel's house, into Daniel's name on whatever comes next. Keep it simple. She said it lightly. She always said it lightly. That was what had taken me 20 years to understand, that the lightness wasn't carelessness, it was certainty. She wasn't guessing at something. She was reciting something she believed had never been in question. I reached into my bag. I hadn't planned exactly what I'd say. I'd thought about it for days, turning over different versions of the sentence, ones that explained, ones that defended, ones that softened. In the end, none of them felt right. So I let the paper speak first. I set the worn leather folder on the table, beside the coffee cups, beside the legal pad with Daniel's careful handwriting on it. I didn't slide it toward anyone. I just opened it and laid the deed flat on the wood. Before we go any further, I said, I think we should all start from the same history. The room went quiet in a way I'd never heard it go quiet before. Not the polite quiet of a pause in conversation, the quiet of something settling. Diane looked at the paper, then at me, then back at the paper. She picked it up slowly, the way you pick up something you're not entirely sure you want to be holding. I watched her eyes move down the page, the county seal, the date, 6 months before the wedding. My name, my maiden name, the one she'd probably forgotten I'd ever had, listed alone under buyer. She read it once. Then her eyes went back up to the top, like she expected the second reading to say something different. It didn't. She looked up, not at me first, but around the room, at Daniel, at the window, at the hallway, where the light from the kitchen spilled out over the wall of photographs she'd walked past 1,000 times without truly seeing. I think she was searching for the version of the story she'd been carrying for 20 years, the one where the house had always, naturally, simply belonged to her son. I watched her look for it the way you look for your glasses when you're fairly sure you just had them in your hand. It wasn't there anymore. Daniel was the one who finally spoke, and he didn't raise his voice and he didn't perform any kind of speech. He just said it plainly, the way you'd correct a fact that had quietly been wrong for too long. Mom. Sarah bought this house before we were even engaged. I helped paint a few rooms. That's all I did. Diane's mouth opened slightly. Nothing came out of it. I didn't add anything. I decided, somewhere in the days before that evening, that I didn't need to win the moment. I only needed it to be true in front of her, finally, the way it had always been true everywhere else. Diane set the deed down, very carefully, like she was afraid of damaging it further. Her eyes drifted, almost without her meaning them to, toward the hallway again. Toward one photograph in particular, the one near the end of the wall, the one of me standing alone in an empty living room, holding a small brass key, years before any of them had become my family. She had walked past that photograph hundreds of times. I don't think she'd ever actually looked at it. I watched her look at it now. No one explained what it meant. No one needed to. She didn't say she was sorry. She didn't say anything at all, not that night. She just sat there, very still, with a piece of paper in front of her that had quietly, finally, told her the truth she'd spent 20 years rewriting. I sat across from her, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, the silence in that room didn't feel like something I had to fill. If this story moved you, let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is right now for you. I love knowing how far these stories travel. And if you'd like more stories like this one, real, emotional, the kind that stay with you, subscribe to the channel and hit like. It genuinely helps us keep bringing you these stories faster and better. Thank you for spending this time with me. I'll see you in the next one.